Our panel, Can the University Be Saved? A Jewish View. I'm Peter Berkowitz, a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I'm delighted to be joined by Jonathan Haidt, a professor at New York University, and Elliot Kaufman, a writer and editor at the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. Earlier this year, this academic year, University of Michigan professor of cultural studies wrote a breezy email to a student. The email reads, "Dear Abigail, I am very sorry, but I only scanned your first email a couple of weeks ago and missed out on a key detail. As you may know, many university departments have pledged an academic boycott against Israel in support of Palestinians living in Palestine. This boycott includes writing letters of recommendation for students planning to study there. I should have let you know earlier, and for that I apologize. But for reasons of these politics, I must rescind my offer to write your letter. Let me know if you need me to write other letters for you, as I'd be happy." In fact, the University of Michigan does not boycott Israel or Israeli products. Last year, the state of Michigan prohibited such boycotts. Nevertheless, the professor nonchalantly refused to write a letter in support of an otherwise worthy student simply because she wanted to study in Israel. His conduct reflects the widespread politicization of undergraduate education. It also exhibits the anti-Israel animus that constitutes a key component of campus political orthodoxy. The corruption of liberal education in America has been a long time in the making. In 1951, the young William F. Buckley published God and Man at Yale. It documents the use of the curriculum to advance progressive aims. In the late 1960s, the public interest devoted a special issue to universities. At the time, students were demanding the transformation of the curriculum into a vehicle for achieving left-wing social change. Administrators and professors complied. In the 1970s, many students of the 1960s brought to graduate school programs in the humanities and social sciences the view that teaching and scholarship should be seen as, I quote here, politics by other means. In the late 1980s, not long after the first wave of the 1960 students became tenured professors, an obscure professor of political philosophy at the University of Chicago published what became an unlikely New York Times bestseller about the decline of higher education in America. In The Closing of the American Mind, Alan Bloom argued that colleges taught a dogmatic relativism that impoverished students' souls and left them ill-prepared to understand liberty and self-government. Bloom advocated a return to the study of the great books. In the late 1990s, University of Pennsylvania professor Alan Charles Kors and attorney Harvey Silverglate, 20 years ago, published The Shadow University. They carefully examined higher education's betrayal of free speech and due process. In 1999, Kors and Silverglate established the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Over the last 20 years, this exemplary organization has confronted a mounting workload of cases involving the defense of free speech and due process. And today, over the summer, Brown University removed from the university website a research paper by a physician and Brown Assistant Professor of the Practice of Behavioral and Social Science. Why remove the paper? Because the research suggested that gender dysphoria occurring in puberty could result from peer pressure. So much for free speech. Also this summer, more than 40 prominent academics wrote a letter to the New York University President and Provost to demand that charges of sexual misconduct against leading postmodern literary theorist Professor Avital Ronell be disregarded. Why disregard the charges? Because, the prominent academics argued, Ronell is a distinguished scholar and she is their friend. So much for due process. A few weeks ago, some Yale Law School professors canceled classes. Why? To allow students to travel to Washington to protest then Judge, now Justice, Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation to the Supreme Court. For the same purpose, the University of South Maine offered students a tuition-free credit to travel to Washington and protest Kavanaugh. So much for a non-politicized curriculum. To save our universities, we must appreciate that the struggle for free speech, for due process, and for a solid core curricula are part and parcel of the same struggle, the struggle for liberal education. So what is liberal education? Why is the struggle for it vitally important? And why should Jews especially care? In brief, liberal education is education for freedom. Liberal education is vitally important because it's indissolubly bound up with our freedom, our prosperity, and our national security. And Jews in America should especially care about liberal education because our tradition cherishes learning and clings to wisdom, and because liberal democracy in America, which depends on liberal education, has conferred great blessings on our community. Jews in Israel also have an abiding interest in liberal education, inasmuch as the Jewish state is also devoted to the protection of essential freedoms and democratic self-government. Of course, the liberal in liberal education does not mean progressive or of the left. It refers rather to the modern tradition of freedom, out of which the American Constitution emerged. This tradition holds that human beings are by nature free and equal. It regards government's chief purpose as securing individual rights under law. It regards legitimate government as grounded in the consent of the governed. It secures the rights shared equally by all through limited government, free markets, and a vibrant civil society. Liberal education fortifies the American experiment in self-government by furnishing and refining students' minds. It furnishes minds with knowledge of literature, history, math and science, economics and politics, morals, philosophy, and knowledge of religion. It refines minds by teaching students to ask probing questions, to consider matters from a variety of points of view, and to respect dissenting opinions, to examine them, and discover the portion of truth that they contain. In short, as Americans and as Jews, we have an urgent interest in saving our universities by restoring liberal education. Jonathan Haidt and Elliot Kaufman will help us think through the challenges. Jonathan Haidt is a professor, New York University Stern School of Business. He's a founder, as most of you know, of Heterodox Academy, which champions viewpoint diversity on campus. He's author most recently, with Greg Lukianoff, of the New York Times bestseller, The Coddling of the American Mind. He's also published The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, and The Happiness Hypothesis, Finding Modern Truth in Ancient Wisdom. Elliot Kaufman edits and writes for the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, where he's been a Robert Bartley Fellow. Elliot is a recent graduate of Stanford University and distinguished alum of Hertog Political Studies and the Tikva Fund. He's written for National Review and Commentary, and from his last 4 years at Stanford, he brings a wealth of firsthand experience of the weaponization of higher education against Israel. Please, Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to share the stage with Peter, who will be honored in a couple of days at the Manhattan Institute for his years of very, very insightful writing on these problems and related problems. To share it with Elliot, who's written one of the sharpest and clearest essays linking these new problems that we're talking about to the interests of the Jewish community, and especially on campus. To be invited here by Roger Hertog, who was a friend of my father's from many decades ago, and to be here talking with you about this very important problem. As Peter said, it's not an old problem. There have been waves of political correctness. Even back in the 50s, there were complaints that universities leaned left. As you'll see, leaning left is not necessarily a problem. Things have changed. This time is different. there's some new elements, and that's especially what Elliot will be talking about. There's some new elements. There are many threads coming together to make this time different and that wrap up the problems in the universities with larger problems in our country. So I'll try to give you a very condensed view of a part of the argument in the book, in The Coddling of the American Mind, that will set up Elliot to talk about his expertise and then set us up for discussion. So I think all of this makes more sense. All of this makes more sense if we keep our eye on the telos of the university. So as many of you remember from philosophy classes, Aristotle would analyze things in terms of its telos. What is the telos of a knife? It's to cut, and so if something doesn't cut, it's not a good knife. The telos of a physician is to heal, so if a person who claims to be a physician doesn't heal people, he or she is not a good physician. What's the telos of a university that allows us to say that some are good and some are no good? Well, I think the answer is can be seen in the story that we tell about ourselves. This is Raphael's famous painting, The School of Athens, and you see philosophers, you see Plato and Aristotle in the center. And there's a lot of activity, but it's not fighting, it's not play, it's disputation, it's argument. It's the process by which differing views come together and something amazing happens, which is the truth comes out, truth that could not have been found by any individual on their own. So this is the process we see in action, and this tells us that the telos, the purpose of all of this, the reason that they're together, it's right there on the crests of our top universities. The telos of a university is truth, or Yale doubles up on it, lux at light and truth. Also related is knowledge. So those of you who remember the motto of Faber College from the 1970s, from Animal House, knowledge is good. So this is the story we tell about ourselves, but my co-author, Greg Lukianoff, began to notice that something strange was happening. So here's Greg's story. Greg is subject to depression, and he had the most serious one of his life in 2007. He very nearly killed himself. He checked himself into a hospital, and when he was released, he went into cognitive behavioral therapy. And in CBT, you learn to identify these distortions that many of us do, but depressed and anxious people do constantly. So emotional reasoning, catastrophizing, mind reading. He learned to identify his distorted thoughts and then to stop doing that. Well, Greg goes on leading FIRE, as Peter mentioned. And then only in 2013, 2014, in that academic year, for the first time, he now sees students demanding protections from speech. He'd never seen that before. FIRE was always pushing back against the administrators, defending the students. Now students are asking for protections from speech, and the reasoning they give is catastrophizing, emotional reasoning, black and white thinking. Greg recognizes this from his clinical experience. And so Greg came to talk to me, because I'd written, in my first book, I'd written about CBT, and he says, John, I think if students are learning to think this way, then they're going to get depressed. We're going to see a wave of depression and anxiety on campus. And I thought this was an amazing idea, so I volunteered myself to be the second author on a paper that I suggested that he write, and we submitted this... And we submitted this paper to The Atlantic at the end of 2014, or in January 2015. And right around this time, so the reason why what Greg was seeing was all this stuff was happening. Trigger warnings, I'd never heard of them until 2014. Safe spaces, I mean, we heard of them from Bosnia, but nobody knew that they needed them at Brown University because there was going to be a debate between two feminists, one of whom said that America is not a rape culture. And if a feminist were to say that America is not a rape culture, that could invalidate some ideas that some Brown students have, and if their ideas are invalidated, they could be traumatized, they could be damaged. They have to be protected from having ideas invalidated. Around this time, we started seeing many more professors saying that they were teaching on eggshells, that they're afraid of their students. So all this was going on as we were writing up our article. We published it in August of 2015 in The Atlantic, and then all hell broke loose 2 months later at Halloween. You know, Halloween, that really dangerous holiday. Not that anyone has ever put a razor blade in an apple. That has actually never happened, but people wear costumes, and that could be even more dangerous. I don't want to make too much light of it, but the point is that beginning at Yale and Halloween in particular, a set of protests and demands and ultimatums spread to many, many universities. Originally they were about racial matters, but they spread very quickly to all kinds of issues, including food. Food can be cultural appropriation. Milo Yiannopoulos' talk at Berkeley was the first really big episode of violence. Now, it wasn't necessarily students who were committing the violence, but students were in with the protesters who were destroying things and bashing people on the head with poles. So Berkeley was this gigantic blow-up, followed 1 month later by the attack on Charles Murray and Professor Alison Stanger at Middlebury, followed by just a wave of protest, students coming into class to protest in class every day for a year at Reed. It then spread to law schools. It's now in graduate programs as well. To keep an eye on it, the puzzle, it seemed to come out of nowhere, this emergence of what we call a new culture of safetyism. If you see these concepts, they all travel together. If you see students talking about safe spaces, trigger warnings, microaggressions, bias response teams, if they analyze America or any institution as a matrix of oppression, if there's a call-out culture where you have to be careful, any single word, if you use the unapproved word, it could lead to major shaming effort against you. This is the culture that emerged suddenly. It's not on most college campuses. There are 4,700 institutions of higher ed. Most of them don't have this. But elite schools in the Northeast and the West Coast especially, and liberal arts colleges even more so, generally have this. That's what our book is about. I hope you'll read it, but I'll give you a very abbreviated version of it right now because I think it'll give us the tools we need to talk about in our conversation later. The middle part of the book explains why it seemed to come out of nowhere. It's not that suddenly something happened in 2013 to 2014. Rather, there are 6 trends going on for a decade or two. The rising political polarization, which, as Peter was talking about, the more left and right hate each other, the more political goals seem to be the goals of teachers. Politics by other means makes more sense during a very pitched culture war. Rising anxiety and depression, as I'll show you. Anyway, there's a lot of historical reasons why it all sort of caught fire, why it all burst forth in 2013 to about 2016. By then, it was all in place. I won't go through all of those. Rather, I'll focus on the heart of the book is on 3 really, really terrible ideas. Ideas so bad that if your children adopt these ideas as their own, if they come to believe these ideas, I cannot guarantee that they will fail, but I would bet against them being successful in life. So let's walk through them. The first really bad idea is that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Now, of course, you recognize that this is an inversion of Nietzsche's dictum, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. So children... looking at the audience, I'm guessing most of you are parents here. And when you bring your baby home from the hospital, it is an incredibly fragile thing. And when your baby gets hurt or your toddler gets hurt, it's painful and you want to protect it. It's a normal human urge. The problem is, if you begin protecting and protecting and protecting, you kind of have to keep doing it. And then you keep doing it all the way. You got to get them to college, and you can't just let them go in college. You have to be there when they're gone. And so... This is what American parents began doing, especially in the 1990s. We got this ridiculous idea that if we ever take our eyes off our kids, they will be abducted. Now, we got this stupid idea just as the crime rate was plummeting. Most of us were let out at the age of 7 or 8. We could walk in the streets, we could go to our friends' houses during the crime wave. And then just as the crime wave ends, now we don't let kids out until they're about 13 or 14 in most sort of suburban environments. What we've forgotten, but most of our parents or grandparents knew, is that the goal of a parent is to prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. Another way of saying it is that the goal of a parent is to work him or herself out of a job. What are the consequences of our failure to work ourselves out of jobs? We don't know why this is happening. The depression and anxiety rates are skyrocketing, especially for girls. I can't say this is entirely because of overprotection or entirely because of social media. We don't know why. But those are the 2 main factors, overprotection and social media. This is teenage Americans, this is federal data, who report 5 out of 9 symptoms of major depression. If you report 5 or more symptoms, you're classified as having a major depressive episode. So it is now the case, the rate for girls in 2015 is now 1 in 5 teenage American girls reports having had a major depressive episode in the last year, and that is way up just since 2011. If we focus just on campus, it's the same story. This is, do you have a psychological disorder? That's now crucial is to recognize college students are not millennials. The millennial generation ended with birth year 1994. Kids born in 1995 are having a very different childhood from kids born in, say, 1992. Because kids born in 1995 and after generally got iPhones and social media in middle school, and that's really devastating. We've got to get iPhones and especially social media out of middle school and even out of perhaps ninth grade. But the point is, something happened such that kids born in 1995 are much more likely to be depressed, anxious, and fragile. And so as you see, the rate for male college students is up, but the rate for female college students is way up. In 2012, there were no members of iGen or Gen Z on campus. In 2016, there are no millennials left. It's all iGen or Gen Z, and this is the result. Now, this is not just self-report. This is not just that young people are more comfortable admitting psychological issues, because even though you hear reports about, you hear all these reports about this wave of anxiety and depression, it shows up in the suicide rate. What we see is that as soon as iGen or Gen Z enters the picture, the rate goes up for both sexes. The rate is up if we look at boys. This is teenage boys, federal data. I took the average of 2001 to 2010 to get a nice steady baseline. And how much is it up since 2013? The answer is 25%. The suicide rate for teenage American boys is up 25% in the last 6 or 7 years. For girls, it's up 70%. The suicide rate for teenage American girls is up 70% in the last 8 or so years. So this is a national disaster, and this is part of the background of what's happening on campus. We have a lot more depressed and anxious students. They are flooding mental health centers. They respond much more strongly to a word, a book, a visiting speaker. It's much more painful to them than it was for millennials. Bad idea number 2, I'll have to greatly compress this one. Always trust your feelings. No, this is a really, really bad idea. It's the opposite of ancient wisdom in most traditions, and it's the opposite of CBT. As Epictetus put it, it is not things that disturb us, but our interpretation of their significance. So I'll jump to bad idea number 3, because this is really the one that Elliot will be talking about intersectionality. So life is a battle between good people and evil people. This is something we are born prepared to believe. We evolved in a tribal context. We evolve as members of groups that were in competition with other groups. We're all prone to this way of thinking, and it takes a great deal of wisdom to break out of it. One of the opening quotes of our book is from Alexander Solzhenitsyn: "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." Now, you read this, we all recognize it's true, but it takes some effort. It's much easier to fall into the tribal trap than it is to believe this. The logic of tribalism is captured in this wonderful Bedouin proverb: I against my brothers, I and my brothers against my cousins, I and my brothers and cousins against the world. So if you're with me that we evolved for tribalism, we can do that at the drop of a hat. We can get into us versus them, but we're capable of transcending it. And even traditional tribes actually are also very good at trade. They're interested in other groups. They can do that. They can bury the hatchet. So we can go either way on this. Given that, what should we do on campus? If we're trying to create more diverse societies, we're all trying to increase diversity, how can we get benefit from that diversity? Well, there's a theory that is widely taught on campus called intersectionality, and that's what we'll be talking about for much of the rest of our time together. At its core, it's a very good idea. The idea put forth by Kimberly Crenshaw in her TED Talk, there's nothing objectionable in the TED Talk. She lays it out very well. It's just the idea that people have a variety of identities, and the effects of these are not just additive. To be a black woman in America is not just the sum of the black experience and the female experience. There are unique indignities, unique experiences of being a black woman. Correct. It has to be true. Any social scientist will recognize that there are main effects and interaction effects, so that's all good. The problem is that as it is actually taught on campus, it is taught to students, to 18, 19-year-olds who come in with tribal minds ready to be amplified or turned down. It is taught in this way. Students are taught to see more dimensions of difference, more and more binary dimensions. And they're not just random categorizations, they are moral dimensions. Every membership group, every group above the line is bad because they are privileged and they have power and they oppress. Those are the bad people. The people below the line are the good people because they are the victims resisting oppression. So as it is taught this way, and again, don't think that all students are learning it. It's especially students in what we call the grievance studies, the ones who take courses that specialize in this way of thinking. But I would also add education, social work, and anthropology. Those 3 fields also go in very big for this. Students who take those courses come out to write things like this. This was an article written by a student at Texas State University. Ontologically speaking, white death will mean liberation for all. Until then, remember this. I hate you because you, white people, shouldn't exist. You are both the dominant apparatus on the planet and the void in which all other cultures, upon meeting you, die. All right, now, fine. So a student at a university in Texas goes overboard and writes what is clearly a racist rant against white people. But it's not just a random student here and there. It's now an acceptable way of thinking in the Washington Post. Why can't we hate men? Now, of course, he's a criminal. He should go to jail. But should we judge all men by the actions of a few? Well, yes. According to this professor of gender studies and sociology, we women as a group have every right to hate you, men as a group. You have done us wrong. And it's at the New York Times. Sarah Jeong was hired, I guess 6 or 8 months ago. There was a big controversy because all over her Twitter account were all kinds of really nasty things against white people. Dumbass effing white people marking up the internet with their opinions like dogs pissing on fire hydrants. Cancel white people. Oh man, it's kind of sick how much joy I get out of being cruel to old white men. Now, many people on campus think that this is not racism or sexism because if you're pushing, it's called punching up. Punching up the people above the line is virtuous. That's a good thing to do. And as if to put a perfectly fine ribbon on it for me, Jessica Valenti, the feminist who was arguing that America is a rape culture, then tweeted, Sarah Jeong is good, her haters are bad. It's not difficult. Now that's great untruth number 3. Life is a battle between good people and evil people. This is what she believes. Elliot will talk about his article, but this line here captures it perfectly, why this is important for Jews. He says, what I saw that year at Stanford in 2014 was a well-oiled machine whose leaders were able to whip their constituent groups into action and frame the issues as the weak versus the strong, the weak versus the Jews. I had just been introduced to intersectionality and witnessed its grip on the American campus. What should we do instead? Well, the answer is actually found in many faith traditions, and the Christianity of the civil rights leaders is beautiful. What Martin Luther King and Pauli Murray did was to talk relentlessly about their white brothers and sisters, to draw larger circles. As she said, I intend to destroy segregation by positive and embracing methods. When my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. This is the way to do diversity. This is the way to do civil rights. This is the way to do identity politics. This is common humanity identity politics, which we think is good, we say in chapter 3 in the book, in contrast to common enemy identity politics, which is what is taught on many campuses today. So imagine a university built on those 3 untruths. Now, I happen to pick the gate of Brown University because it is embracing these more than most of the other Ivies, or I should say, it is embracing them pretty wholeheartedly. But imagine instead that you sent your kid to a university based on the opposite. And I've chosen the University of Chicago here. Again, there's variety in every university. Go Chicago. I did a postdoc there. I love the place. That's the summary of the book. Now, just to apply it, my last section, to apply this even more particularly to Judaism, there's a reason why Jews have flourished in universities, and there's a reason why Jews should be especially concerned about these trends. So let me just tell you, Peter mentioned that I co-founded Heterodox Academy. I was always on the left. I'm just sort of, as a social scientist, I stopped being on any side now. I'm just trying to study it. But what I began noticing as a social psychologist is this shift. This is nationally representative data. In 1996, the ratio of left to right among American faculty was 2 to 1. But by 2011, it had shifted from 5 to 1. Now, 5 to 1, but remember, that's everybody. Most of the Republicans, that was based on left-right. Most of the right, they're in the dental school, the agriculture school, and the engineering school. If you look at the English department or the philosophy department, you don't get 5 to 1. It's much, much higher. So me and a few other psychologists, we teamed up to write a paper that was published in a top journal analyzing this just from a straight quality of science perspective. This is not partisan. This is just if we want our disciplines to work well, do we need political diversity? And our answer was yes. We gathered all the available sources. We looked at our own field, psychology. What we found is that the ratio varied from 2 to 1 up to 4 to 1, left, right, in psychology. Not surprising. It's a left-leaning discipline. But again, Look what happened after 1996. It had gone up to 14-1, and we have a new data point by Mitch Langbert, 2016, 17-1. And there's only really one, and I know him. He's a very nice guy. He's at Bryn Mawr College. Now, this causes some very serious problems for the quality of the research. Many of you have heard the term confirmation bias. If you're really, really smart, you're not better at looking on the other side, you're just really, really good at finding evidence on your side. So confirmation bias, the genius of a university is you pit people's confirmation biases against each other, and we each disconfirm each other's ideas unless we're all on the same side, in which case we don't disconfirm each other's preconceived notions. A minority influence is a huge area of research in sociology and psychology on the benefits of having dissenting minorities within your midst. If you want this to work, you have to have viewpoint diversity. And what group gets that better than any other on earth? The Jews. We have it. It's in the Torah. It's in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. Iron sharpens iron, and one person sharpens the wits of another. There's a wonderful story in the Babylonian Talmud of Rabbi Yohanan, who had a debate partner, his former student, Reish Lakish. And when Reish Lakish dies, Rabbi Yohanan is inconsolable. His intellectual life is destroyed. He no longer has someone to argue with. And the rabbis of the community, they get together, they say, what can we do? And they send someone out to comfort him, to debate with him. But the person that they send out is not good at disagreeing. He's trying to support Rabbi Yohanan, and so he tends to agree with him. And then Rabbi Yohanan says, in my discussions with Reish Lakish, when I would state a matter, he would raise 24 difficulties against me in an attempt to disprove my claim. And I would answer him with 24 answers. And the law by itself would become broadened and clarified. And yet you say to me, there is a ruling that supports your opinion. Do I not know that what I say is good? Being rebutted by Reish Lakish served a purpose. Your bringing proof to my statements does not. Jews understand, the Talmudic tradition understands that it is by debate, it is by viewpoint diversity that we advance. This has never been said more succinctly than by John Stuart Mill. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. And so that's why I and some other social psychologists originally, but now we've got 2,300 professors, including several in the room here, who've joined Heterodox Academy, and we're totally nonpartisan. We are accepted within the university because we are of the university. We're not attacking from the right. We're talking about the quality of science, the quality of our research, and so we're making enormous progress. One of our best successes is we've created a program called Open Mind. If you go to openmindplatform.org, you can download it. You can use it in your synagogue. You can use it in your kids' high school. You can use it in your chess team, any place where you're divided. And boy, Jews are divided these days. Any place where people are divided, this teaches you skills of how to actually talk across lines of difference. So, to conclude, if we want to return our universities to this telos of truth, we need viewpoint diversity, and Jews, more than any other group, understand that and are in a position to do something about it. Thank you.
When I was a freshman at Stanford University, it wasn't Students for Justice in Palestine versus the pro-Israel group. We could have handled that. Instead, there were 19 different student groups of every race and every ethnicity pitted against the Jewish students alone. It wasn't a fair fight. We were so out-organized. Before we knew what hit us, every marginalized group had signed onto a BDS resolution. Every dorm and every bathroom on campus was filled with anti-Israel posters. And in the end, it was a left-wing Jewish student council member who cast the deciding vote against Israel. I was left with many questions. For instance, why does the black student group oppose Israel and protest against Israel? I wondered if there were some complicated theory behind it all, by which the situation in the West Bank came to bear directly on black Americans. There is such a theory. It's called intersectionality, and it is committed to finding the links and intersections between disadvantaged groups and their respective struggles. Intersectional coalitions have formed across America. At Stanford, the intersectional coalition was called SOCC. That's SOCC, the Students of Color Coalition. Together, the Black, Latino, Asian, and Islamic student groups centralize and coordinate almost all student activism. SOCC has also won a majority of the student council seats in every election for the past decade. It provides the votes, and then in return, its endorsed candidates advocate for more money for ethnic and racial community centers, more diversity and anti-sexual assault trainings, and divestment from Israel. Intersectionality is an extremely useful ideology for this kind of organization. Its thrust is to recognize how different identities overlap, how each form of identity, such as women, gays, blacks, or Muslims, cannot be understood separately from one another, how the small slight that you experienced yesterday is actually produced by the larger structural forces affecting all marginalized groups. How it's essential to reject the false choice of race or sex or class and focus on all of them together. In fact, the theory demands the formation of a rainbow coalition. If the treatment of one race is shaped by the same forces that affect all other oppressed groups, and indeed cannot be understood apart from them, then black groups had better make common cause with Muslims, Latinos, and so forth. Now, this allows Students for Justice in Palestine or other individual activists to inject their singular fanaticism about Israel into every other campus protest. Black groups can blame police violence in part on Israel, which runs a few training sessions for US police officers. A wall with Mexico is compared to Israel's apartheid fence. Stop and frisk becomes West Bank checkpoints. Native American land claims now equal a Palestinian right of return. Everything is conflated and twisted into a simple narrative of collective resistance. Now, in intersectional movements, you have to stay on your toes. Anyone at any moment can be accused of some kind of bigotry. If you're a feminist who has planned a rally protesting violence against women, but you didn't mention trans women enough, you risk a public accusation of erasing trans suffering. If you respectfully disagree with the Ferguson to Palestine link and insist that we should narrowly tackle police violence and leave Israel out of it, you risk another denunciation. Keeping two movements separate, one issue at a time, that kind of thinking is antithetical to intersectionality. It undermines the coalition by dividing it. Jews, however, are not members of the coalition. First, most Jews are white, and whites are a suspect class. Second, many Jews are wealthy, and the wealthy are a suspect class. Third, the vast majority are Zionists, and to the movement's radicals, Zionists are also a suspect class. Nevertheless, individual Jews and whites can become allies of the intersectional movement. That means that by checking their privilege and publicly self-flagellating for their inherent racism, they're allowed in the room. Except even then, the role of allies is to step back, shut up, and listen. Airing disagreements is crowding out the voices of people of color. The role of allies is certainly not to tell people of color when their own oppression is or isn't relevant. So after the coalition's leaders agree, they tell their groups that opposing the Israeli occupation, ethnic cleansing, is an important part of their own struggle. Every marginalized group is on board. It's only the power structure that's against it. That's the campus Republicans, the conservatives, and the Jews. So whose side are you on? The choice is easy. And frankly, elite campuses are so self-segregated racially. If you are a black student, you could face real social costs for standing up to the coalition. And why would you? You've probably heard about Israel doing bad things anyway. So soon enough, the pronouncements of a few campus radicals can become a real group consensus. And from the resulting clash with Jewish students, Jewish organizations, and in some sense, Jewish power, anti-Semitism blooms. Jewish students see themselves as defending Israel from libel, but seen through an intersectional lens where white and Jewish equals the power structure, Jewish organizing on campus looks like kicking down at marginalized people. This reduction of complexity in which Jews are white and powerful and nothing else is not an accident. Intersectional analysis of individual identity does not extend to the privileged. One of intersectionality's leading theorists calls this strategic racial essentialism. I just call it unprincipled. Israel gets that same skewed treatment. White, wealthy, and Jewish. Israel is capitalism, colonialism, racism, nationalism, Americanism, all rolled into one. And that's before you even get into what Israel has or hasn't done to the Palestinians. It is a leap, but not a great one, to get from here to anti-Semitism. That Israel or white Jews are not just connected to those evils through a complex system of power relations, but they're actually behind those evils. And the intersectional coalition, Manichaean to its core, is highly vulnerable to these sorts of conspiracies. And in mass movements, theories become vulgarized. Talk of structural forces falls away, and what's left is a small group of elites extending its tentacles all over the world to oppress the weak. In other words, to some portion of the movement, it starts to sound a lot like the House of Rothschild or the Elders of Zion in the anti-Semitic imagination. Now, intersectionality is supposed to be sensitive to bigotry, yet Jews who want intersectional coalitions to fight anti-Semitism are accused of trying to make the movement all about them. Even worse, activists will claim that accusations of anti-Semitism are just cynical projections of Jewish power used to silence critics. The truth is, intersectional coalitions see fighting Jewish power as punching up, as speaking truth to power. Since that's how anti-Semites see themselves as well, they can easily embed their hatred within intersectional movements. Now, I want to read you two quotes. First, from an introduction to intersectionality by Patricia Hill Collins, a major black feminist and intersectional thinker on the UN's World Conference Against Racism held in Durban, South Africa. Quote, "The importance of Durban for intersectionality's global reach cannot be overstated. Imagine some 10,000 people from all around the world, women in the majority, learning about each other's struggles. Representatives from the South African landless movement, indigenous movements, and the Palestinian Intifada all attended. The representatives brought multi-issue frameworks reflecting the complexity of their lived experiences and political struggles, end quote. She later calls it a watershed moment for intersectionality. But if you've heard of the Durban Conference before, you've likely heard of it for a very different reason. Let me read you another account of that same conference, this time from a group of Jewish students who were there. Quote, Jewish activists were harassed, abused, physically intimidated, taunted, and followed. Anyone who tried to object to the Israel Hate Fest was booed off the stage with shouts of Jew, Jew, Jew. The conference hall was overflowing with copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and pamphlets featuring pictures of Jews with long hooked noses and evil smiles, their serpent fangs soaked in blood, and their military uniforms decorated with swastikas. At the conference's only panel devoted to anti-Semitism, dozens of protesters stormed the tent, screaming, "You are all murderers. You have Palestinian blood on your hands." Israeli flags were burned in front of the European Union of Jewish Students table, and Jewish activists were accosted by members of Hamas, end quote. All of this while intersectionality was having its watershed moment, with extraordinary solidarity between the South African landless, indigenous groups, and the Palestinian Intifada, everyone except the Jews. Intersectionality, which claims to see so far and explain so much, has from the start been blind to the anti-Semitism right in front of its nose. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank John and Elliot for two outstanding presentations, and I want to give them a reward for two outstanding presentations. Some questions. First for John. As in your book, you focus today on the psychology of students. Unfortunate psychology, a set of principles that they've acquired. But I wonder about faculty, a little more about faculty. A rough estimate in your battles on behalf of viewpoint diversity, what percentage of faculty would you say today are genuinely hostile? What percentage simply indifferent? What percentage are in favor? And then, how come everybody is not strongly in favor, since viewpoint diversity, as you suggest, is essential to their educational mission?
So do you mean strongly in favor of what? Of viewpoint diversity, or
viewpoint diversity, liberty of thought, viewpoint diversity, liberty of thought and discussion.
Yeah. So since I started studying this topic, and then since I founded Heterodox Academy, I've come to the conclusion that the great majority of faculty are what I would call liberal left, which means that they believe in freedom of speech. They think that viewpoint diversity is valuable. They are visibly, recognizably members of the liberal tradition. Then there's a smaller number that are what I would call the illiberal left. Almost the definition of an illiberal is someone who says, I'm going to tell you what you can say, what you can wear, what you can't eat. Someone who tries to... The liberal tradition, I'm a big fan of John Stuart Mill, is about how do we create societies in which we afford people the maximum ability to design the lives that they want to live without government coercion, et cetera. And what's happening is we have allowed, or there's been flourishing, in certain departments, especially the grievance studies fields, professors who see their duty as fighting for a version of social justice, fighting the right, fighting against conservatives. And so the great majority are liberal left, but they're terrified of the illiberal left. I would say all faculty members live in a state of ophobophobia That is, we live in the constant fear of being called something phobic. And so that's why we see, so what's happened, since I've been doing this, people keep telling me, oh my God, you must be taking so many attacks, it must be so hard to do what you're doing. No, it actually isn't. Nothing bad has happened to me, because the great majority of professors are not crazy, they're not radical, they're on the left, but they're liberal left. So where we are is very much in an emperor's new clothes or preference falsification situation in which the number of people who are truly opposed to the sorts of things we want to do is not that large. Please don't believe that college professors or faculties are rabid left-wing ideologues. Some are, and in certain departments it's a majority, but in the great majority of departments there's very few of them.
Thanks. We'll follow up. Question now for Elliot. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, as you demonstrate, you're fresh from the front lines of these struggles. Do you have a sense, to what extent did your fellow students bring to the campus the ideas about intersectionality you described, and to what extent did they acquire these ideas while on campus?
That's an interesting question. I think that they mostly brought them, or the way I would put it is that they came ready to hear those sorts of things. And then many of them took courses in the grievance studies majors or even adjacent majors. And those were perhaps what radicalized them, you could say. But I think it's everywhere in the online news we read, in the media generally, that you want to be on the side of the marginalized. And I mean, when you show quotes up there about from what's her name, Sarah Jeong. I think people my age read those and think, yeah, I mean, we've heard that before. That's a common way of speaking. They don't maybe fully mean that. That's just the way people talk. But stop for one second. Why do people talk that way about white people? Like, that is insane. And I think the fact that that's normal, that she didn't think she was going out on a limb and doing something that would disqualify her from a major job, and neither did the people who stuck by her, including the New York Times editorial board. People, I think these ideas are out there, and they're, if not believed, they are given lip service everywhere, and certainly not challenged in the university.
Elliot, if I could add on something, that's a very important question. And a few years ago, I would have given the answer that Elliot gave, but they might have been ready, but they discovered them in college. Well, what I've learned since running Heterodox Academy is that now the problem is largely baked in high school, especially progressive private schools. Please raise your hand if you have a child who goes to a somewhat progressive private school. Okay, I urge all of you, go into the head of school tomorrow and ask to see the curriculum. Are they using the Southern Poverty Law Center Teach for Tolerance framework? There are a variety of frameworks that are used. They have very nice sounding names, but they are teaching intersectionality. They're making the kids do privilege walks. They are basically, once the Trump election happened especially, the progressive private school faculty all saw again, politics by other means. They have the chance to shape the next generation. They've really been intense about it. Thank God my kids go to New York City public schools where the bureaucracy is so rigid that they can't possibly change the curriculum.
I'm afraid to say that the situation is actually even worse. I have a friend who teaches at Yale. He's a man of the left, and he told me this story against interest. Year ago, whenever it was that Wonder Woman came out, a movie about a superhero, swarthily skinned woman. One day, my friend was at dinner and suggested to his wife that the family go see the movie Wonder Woman. His wife said, great idea. His 7 or 8-year-old son said to him, Daddy, is Wonder Woman about racism? My friend was surprised by the question, said no, went to the movie, the family had a great time. Next weekend, My friend's wife said to him, honey, why don't we take the kids to see Yale baseball? My friend said, great idea. His son said, Daddy, is baseball about racism? Now my friend inquired, and he discovered that his second grade son, although he didn't have the language yet, was learning that racism in the United States is universal, pervasive, and insidious. A smart young kid, so he knows what that means is racism is where you would least expect it. Wonder Woman, baseball. I have a suspicion, John, that the numbers you gave, especially about the break with the new generations, has to do with actually a new generation of parents who are educated in the schools and a new generation of teachers who are now teaching our children from the time they're very young the pernicious psychological ideas and the pernicious philosophical doctrines that Eliot described. We have lots of questions. We have 3 minutes left, but there was one overwhelming question, and one particular card asked this question with the greatest brevity and the greatest legibility. By the way, it's the question that John and Elliot asked me not to ask them at the beginning. So what to do? What is the action plan? That's roughly all the other questions. So, John, you began to speak about progress and maybe hurdles that you face at Heterodox Academy. Sadly, I have to ask you to be brief, and then a moment for Elliot, and then we must honor the demand of the fearsome John Silver that we end very close to 3:15.
Okay, sure.
Go ahead.
So I think we can break the problem into two parts, both of which are solvable because the will is there. So the first part is the parenting part. We have overprotected our kids. I go around the country asking this: at what age do you let your kid? At what age were you let out? At what age could you walk around? Everybody says 5 to 7 years old, if they're over 40. Whereas our kids don't often get out until they're 13, 14, 15. So we've got to do a lot more free-range parenting. We've got to let the kids practice being independent and working out their own conflicts before they get to college, please. So that's why I urge you to go to, Let Grow. Go to letgrow.org, an organization founded by Lenore Skenazy. I'm on the board. Has lots of ideas. So parenting and the most important thing of all here is that on the parenting front, it's very hard to do this by yourself. You can send your kid out, but there's no other kids out there. You can put restrictions on social media, but then your kid is excluded. So leadership at schools has to say, parents, please, let your kids out, and here, they can come play on the playground at school. Parents, please, don't let your kids have social media until they are in high school. Whatever it is, we've got to set norms so that are going to help the kids get out of these destructive practices. That's the first piece. The second piece is at universities, where, again, leadership is absolutely crucial. And here's where many of you, I'm sure, are donors. Raise your hand if you give money, if you give more than $1,000 a year to a university. Please raise your hand. Okay, you can be enormously influential. And it turns out, even if you only give $100 a year, they're so sensitive to what the donors are saying. Most of the presidents actually support free speech, but they're terrified of certain constituents on campus, just as Elliot explained. So they need counter-pressure. You can go to them. So in our book, we have all kinds of suggestions. You can go to them and say, what are you doing about this? And they'll talk a good game to you, but say, no, seriously, what do you do at orientation? Do you tell the students about free speech? Do you tell them that they're not allowed to shout people down or they'll be punished? So I think that both the childbearing piece and the university piece are solvable because most people are actually on our side. Even the people on the liberal left are on our side, but they're all in terror of the much smaller illiberal left. So people need counter-pressure delivered in a thoughtful, sensible, calm way.
Thanks, John. Elliot, a final thought?
Yeah. My experience is that if you, as a student, if it's not a big part of your personal identity to be a good liberal, you won't face that much pressure on Israel. You'll be more or less fine with the support of Israel that presumably you came in with. But if your personal identity is tied up in being accepted as a champion of the marginalized, supporting the progressive movement, opposing the president, or something like that, then many people will want you to choose between that identity and Zionism or support for Israel. So in one sense, the best way to immunize from this is just be conservative. And then just one last thing. And then I think just one last positive thing. I think it's important to put this sort of thing in perspective. The Palestinians' greatest hope for destroying Israel at this point might be, American college kids. And that's an accomplishment for Israel, because there was a time when their greatest hope was Egyptian armies massed on the border threatening to push the Jews into the sea. So I think when you look at it in that way, you'll see that we've come pretty far, and maybe things aren't looking as bad as you might think.